Hey everybody, it's Kayla coming back for chapter 2. Before we get started, I'm going to give you some class updates, just some general what's going on, things have been updated, just giving you some really important information. So number one, we just had our first exam. I want to say I'm really happy with how this class, which is DA9, did on our first exam. The class average, I think, was a 76, which does not sound great. It's a C. However, that was our first exam, and generally it's the hardest, or just like getting used to taking exams in this class, and it covers a lot of material. So now that you know how the exam will go for the future exam, I do believe that those scores are going to increase. So I'm really happy with our first exam. Remember that you are allowed to drop one of your exam grades. There were a few people who missed the exam. That's fine. That will be dropped. It'll be like your 0. You'll drop it. It won't count against you. And if it also ends up being your lowest exam grade, it will be dropped in the final calculation. So I just wanted to say that really quickly. Again, great job, everyone. I was really impressed. So Dr. Anderson sent out a survey. I don't know if you'll see my cat back there. That's Pancake. He says hi. Dr. Anderson sent out a survey, I believe a week or two ago. We had about 25% of students between my class and Dr. Anderson's class who responded, and we were given some really great feedback on how we can improve the course in real time, just how things are going for y'all. So thank you for those of you who did respond. And if you did not get a chance to respond, there will be other times during the semester where we will ask you for your feedback. I believe in using feedback in real time. So there's always ways that we can improve the class. Some of the things that we got from that feedback that we are going to implement now is number one, study guides for exams. I usually do not make study guides for exams. However, there was an overwhelming amount of people who asked if there was one or if one could be made. There was not one for the first exam. There will be one for the second exam. So that will be posted the week before the second exam opens. You will have a study guide. The way I'm thinking about making it, it won't necessarily be questions you answer that would mimic the exam, but I will pull from the 3 chapters the most important information, and I will make sure that information is highlighted on the study guide so you know exactly what you should be looking for to study for the exam. So that's going to be coming up, and then we have a couple other updates. We mainly wanted to know if y'all wanted due dates to be on Fridays or Sundays. And an overwhelming amount of you said you wanted the due dates to be on Sundays. So they're being moved. You'll see reflected. I'm going to do another content refresh to make sure it's updated. So if you don't see this Monday morning, just let me know. I don't see the dates updated, but you should see for the discussion posts, the learning curves, the quizzes, what's the other thing? The assignments. There we go. They will extend to Sundays instead of Fridays. So you have a couple more days, time over the weekend to work on things. With that being said, discussion posts, you still have to make your first discussion post on Wednesday. So your initial post has to be done on Wednesdays, but you have until Sunday to respond to someone else's post in the discussion board. Let's see, what else have we changed? Behavior modification part 1 was originally going to be due on the 9th, but a lot of people have asked for extra time to work on these written assignments after the consumer assignment. So instead of being due on October 9th, we pushed it to November 20th. So the walkthrough video for that assignment is going to be posted this week. And then you will have until the 20th to complete that. I apologize. No, the original assignment was due on the 2nd. Part 1 is going to be due on the 9th instead. And I'll I'll reiterate that in an email. Part 1 is going to be due on the 9th. Part 2 is going to be due on the 20th. So these are both Sundays, so you'll have weekends to work on them. Part 1 is on the 9th. Part 2 is on the 20th of November. 9th of October for the first part. There's going to be a walkthrough video. I'm going to again host office hours for this assignment. No one came to my consumer office hours. I will try to post some additional times because maybe it was a time issue. But I will be posting those office hours if you have any questions. A lot of people wanted more detail for the assignment, wanted me to go into more detail for consumer. So I'm going to try to do that with behavior mod. You will have a video again from Janie Trentham she did the parts of a journal article video for y'all. She's also going to be doing this behavior modification video. But if there are any questions, I'll try to also do like a tips, tricks, additional posting later in the week, but she's going to have your initial video explaining the assignment. Let's see what else. We talked about study guides. We talked about Achieve. Okay. The first unit of Achieve is now open and will be open until December 8th. So we've already had our chapter 1 exam. We want you to still be able to use those learning curves and those quizzes to study for your cumulative final that will be on December 8th. So those are now all reopened. Again, I'm going to do a content refresh just to make sure everything is updated on Canvas. And again, let me know if you're not seeing that. But those will be open. And so if you missed anything, if for some reason you weren't able to finish something, you can now go back in and you can finish those things, and you'll have until December 8th to do so. For the next unit exam, Unit 2, we've decided, myself and Dr. Anderson decided to open up all learning curves for Unit 2 the week before the exam, so that you'll be able to use all of the chapter learning curves to study for the exam. So you still have your set due dates. I really encourage you to hold to those due dates because you will get behind in this class if you don't. However, they're going to be reopened at multiple points throughout the semester. So you have opportunities to go back and use them or go back and complete them if you did not complete them. So I have had a couple emails about people saying that they've missed different learning curves in chapter or unit 1. I might not respond to everyone now that all of them have been reopened. So just go and check. And if you see that if you know that you missed one and you see it's not open, let me know and I can go in and open it for you. Let's see. Making sure there's nothing else. We already talked about unit exam, that you can drop the lowest one if you choose to. Okay, so yeah, that's all the updates. Again, thank you for those who responded to the survey. Really appreciate it. Again, we really like feedback. We can always improve the class in real time. We can only do that if we know what you would like or what you would like to see. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and hop into chapter 2. So this is going to be a pretty dense chapter. I have shortened it. So this is the shortened version of chapter 2. It is biology and behavior. I very much encourage you to go through this lecture with the outline and the handout, right? There's a handout and an outline in the module. Please download both of them, go through this lecture with those documents, because there are a lot of definitions or a lot of very key words. It's very vocabulary heavy chapter because it's biology and behavior. So we're going to be talking about the brain. We're going to be talking about the nervous system, or a lot of bodily functions and how they connect to your behavior, your psychology, things like that. So it's a very dense chapter. It has been shortened. but please use those tools to go along with the lecture because it's very much going to help you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and because this is the shortened PowerPoint, it's only like 55 slides. Instead of having the break that I've been doing, I'm going to just go straight through it. So, you can always pause this video, but there's not going to be two parts. It's just going to be the one part. We're going to go straight through the chapter. So biology and behavior, chapter 2. Some of the things we're going to be going over are the neural and the hormonal systems, tools of discovery and older brain structures, meaning like structures that first form in our brains, the cerebral cortex and the way our brains divided. We're also going to talk about genetics, evolutionary psychology, and behavior. A slight nod to our first chapter where we talked a little bit about the branch of evolutionary psychology, and we talked a little bit about genetics and epigenetics. So what are psychologists concerned with? So why are psychologists concerned with human biology? So everything is psychological. Every idea, every mood, and every urge is also biological, right? We'll go into later the biopsychosocial model and like combines all the things, but everything that has to do with our psychological state of being, our ideas, our mood, our urges are biological. So biological psychologists study links between biology and behavior. So now what are neurons and how do they transmit information? So this is the neural communication. Neurons are nerve cells, and they're the building blocks of the nervous system. They can consist of the cell body, which is the cell's life support center, the dendrites, which are the fibers that receive messages from other cells, the axon that passes messages away from the cell body to other neurons or to muscles or glands, the myelin sheath that covers the axons of some nerves and helps speed neural impulses. You also have the terminal branches of axons that form junctions with other cells. So I know this is a very definition heavy slide. Do take note of these. These are very important. You need to know what these labels are and the definitions, but and just here, right here. This is a visual representation of the neuron. And I'm also going to give you a visual aid that you can use on your own that'll help you remember these. But this is our neuron. This right here is our cell body, right? That's that life support center for the neuron. Then we have the dendrites. They're the little branches that spike out of the neuron and they receive messages from other cells. Then we go into our axon right here. This is the passes messages away from the cell body to other neurons, muscles, or glands, right? So this is like the highway of our neuron. Our neural impulse is action potential, electrical signaling traveling down the axon. So that information, right, comes from another neuron or another space where information is coming from to the dendrites, through the cell body, down the axon, that neural impulse. And then this outer part right here is the myelin sheath. It covers the axon of some neurons and helps the speed of the neural impulse. It quickens that signaling to go through. And then we have the terminal branches of the axon. They form the junction with other cells. So imagine there's two neurons. This part right here would be closer to the dendrites, right? So it's sending information out of those terminal branches and to these other dendrites right here. Another way you can try to remember the neuron is with your arm. So if you take your arm, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see me fully. If you take your arm right here, I'm going to pull my PowerPoint back up so I can make sure I'm not saying the wrong thing. And I'm going to stop. Escape. There we go. Okay. So we have our hand, and we can use our hand to sort of label out the parts of the neuron. So this right here, our palm is going to be our cell body. So this is our cell body. This is the life support center of the neuron. Our fingers are the dendrites. These are the branches that come off of the cell body, right? Cell body, dendrites. Then we have our axon, right? So this is the highway that the cell, the neural impulse travels down from the dendrites to the cell body to the axon. And then I like to think of like my elbow or my shoulder as the terminal branches of the axon that push out that information. And then you can think of the myelin sheath as the skin that covers your arm. That's a really easy way to remember the neuron structure. Let's go back into our PowerPoint. And I'll make this big again. So putting it all together, neurons are the elementary components of the nervous system, right? So this is the body's speedy electrochemical system. Neurons receive signals from branching dendrites and then send signals through the axon. We talked about that, goes through. Some axons are encased in a myelin sheath, not all, but some have that myelin sheath to make that information passing through faster. The glial cells provide myelin and support, nourish, and protect neurons. They may also play a role in learning, thinking, and memory. So the glial cell, if combined, signals received by a neuron exceeds a minimum threshold, the neuron fires, transmitting an electrical impulse down the axon through a chemistry to electricity process. So what that means, I know that sounds really complicated. When you have information coming into a neuron, it has to meet a certain threshold of like energy. If it meets that threshold, then it fires and the information goes to the axon. If it doesn't meet that threshold, it just kind of sits there and nothing really happens. So a neuron reaction is an all or none response. Either it's going to fire and you have that information pass through the axon, or it doesn't do anything. It has to meet that minimum threshold, that minimum energy level to fire off. So we talked about the structure. So action potential is the brief electrical charge that travels down an axon. We talked about the threshold is the level of stimulation required to trigger that neural impulse. And then the refractory period is a resetting pause, is a resting pause that occurs after a neuron has fired. Subsequent action potentials cannot occur until the axon returns to its resting state. So you'll have the threshold met, the action potential, that electrical charge that travels down. And then there is a certain pause before something can travel down again, right? Before the neuron can fire off again. There's a brief pause. It has to come back up to its normal state. So we talk about all or none response, a neuron's reaction of either firing with a full strength response or not firing. It's one or the other. The synapse is the junction between the axon tip of sending information to, the junction between axon tip of sending the neuron and dendrite or cell body of the receiving neuron. So there is little bits of space between the neurons, and that space is called a synapse. And the synaptic gap, right? The tiny gap at the synapse. So how do nerve cells communicate with other nerve cells, right? The neuron receives signals from other neurons. Some are telling it to fire and some are telling it to not fire. When a threshold is reached, the action potential starts moving. it either fires or it doesn't. More stimulation does nothing. So, right, it's an all or none response. Either it's going to go off or it's not. The action potential then travels down. If it fires, the action potential travels down the axon from the cell body to the terminal branches. And then the signal is transmitted to another cell, but must find a way to cross the gap between the cells, right? Because they're not just connected. There's a little bit of a space, the synapse and the synaptic gap, that it must travel across before it can go into the other cell. This is a really good demonstration of that right here. So let's see. Electrical impulses travel down a neuron's axon until it reaches the tiny junction known as the synapse. So we have this sending neuron, and that action potential is traveling down. And remember how I said those terminal branches are sort of connected to the dendrites. So if you think of your elbow as the terminal branches, the fingers going over the elbow are going to be the dendrites. So we're sending that action potential down here. We have a space right here between this terminal branch and this dendrite known as a synapse. And we see that more clearly here, right? The sending neuron, the action potential, the axon terminal, and then we have this synaptic gap. And in that terminal, in that spot where the synaptic gap is, we have these receptor sites on that receiving neuron. And in this space is where we have things like neurotransmitters going through. And we're going to talk a little bit more about neurotransmitters later. But this is where they're going to sort of go through and go into that receiving neuron. So when action potential reaches an axon's end, the terminal, it stimulates the release of a neurotransmitter molecule. These molecules cross the synaptic gap and bind to the receptor sites on the receiving neuron. This allows electrically charged atoms to enter the receiving neuron and excite or inhibit new action potential. Any excess neurotransmitters are reabsorbed. This is a process called reuptake. They drift away or they're broken down by other enzymes. So these neurotransmitters that are sort of brought in or held by that receiving neuron help allow that action potential to either go through or to stop entirely. So what are neurotransmitters? They are chemical messengers that cross the synaptic gap between neurons. They are released by the sending neuron. Neurotransmitters then travel across the synapse and bind to the receptor sites on the receiving neuron. Neurons may or may not generate a neural impulse. So they may or may not fire, depending on if that threshold is met. Reuptake, right? Neurotransmitters are then reabsorbed by the sending neuron, or they will drift away or they're broken down. So how do neurotransmitters influence behavior, and how do drugs and other chemicals impact neurotransmitters? So particular neurotransmitters influence specific behaviors and emotions. Acetylcholine enables muscle action, learning, and memory. Endorphins are natural opiate-like neurotransmitters linked to pleasure and are released in response to pain and exercise. So when you're exercising, your body releases endorphins. Runner's high is linked to like that exercise, releasing a lot of endorphins in the brain. And then drugs and other chemicals affect brain chemistry at the synapse and at the synaptic level. So drugs and other chemicals affect brain chemistry often by either exciting or inhibiting a neuron firing. So an agonist is a molecule that increases the neurotransmitter's actions. Excuse me. An antagonist is a molecule that inhibits or blocks a neurotransmitter's actions. And we're going to go into some examples of why someone would use an agonist and why someone would use an antagonist, depending on what medications they're taking. So what are the functions of the nervous system's main divisions, and what are the three types of neurons? So there's not just one type of neuron, there are three main types. So we have the overall nervous system. It's your body's speedy communication network. It consists of all of the nerves, consisting of all the nerve cells of the central nervous system. So this is your brain and your spinal cord. We're going to talk about the central nervous system more, but when you think of that, I want you to think of something that happens automatically. And we're gonna talk about that in a little bit, but brain and spinal cord, those are the main parts of the central nervous system. Then you have the peripheral nervous system, PNS. These are sensory and motor neurons connected to the central nervous, connecting the central nervous system to the rest of the body, right? They are sort of the bridge between the rest of our body and our central nervous system, being our brain and spinal cord. They gather and transmit information. So somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous systems are within this peripheral nervous system. Then we have nerves, right? Bundled axons forming neural cables connecting the central nervous system with muscles, glands, and sense organs. So this is a really great chart. I would suggest really noting this right in your notes, because this will help you on the exam. The nervous system, we have our two parts. We have our peripheral nervous system and our central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system breaks down more. Central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. So peripheral nervous system then breaks into our autonomic nervous system and our somatic nervous system. Autonomic, somatic. Autonomic controls self-regulated actions of internal organs and glands, right? So this is like your body digesting food, breathing, heartbeat, right? Things you don't have to really think about. The automatic nervous system controls those. Within the automatic nervous system, you have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So sympathetic, it arouses your body's reactions, and then parasympathetic depresses them. You also have your somatic nervous system, which is sensory input and motor output. So this is something, are like the things we feel, taste, see, touch, how our senses input to our nervous system, and then motor output, which is how we move our body. So controls the skeletal muscles. Okay, two parts with subdivisions. The somatic nervous system, the PNS division that controls the body skeletal muscles, we talked about that, our movement. And then the autonomic nervous system, the division that controls the glands and the muscles of the internal organs. Right? Things we don't have to think about: our heart beating, our body digesting, our lungs breathing, right? We don't really have to think about it. And within the autonomic nervous system, we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is arousing, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is calming. So going into those two subdivisions, we have the sympathetic subdivision arouses and expends energy and enables voluntary control of muscle skeletons, or skeletal muscles, sorry, muscle skeletons, that's funny, of skeletal muscles. And then the parasympathetic subdivision calms and conserves energy, so allowing routine maintenance activity and controls involuntary muscles and glands. So this is a chart right here talking about what happens when a specific nervous system is sort of in control, right? When our parasympathetic nervous system is in control, we're in a calm state, right? So our pupils contract. We don't really need to see as much. Our heartbeat slows down. We can digest food. Our gallbladder is stimulated. Our bladder will contract, so we'll go to the bathroom. And then it allows blood flow to sex organs, so you can engage in sexual activity when your parasympathetic nervous system is working and you're calm. Now, if your sympathetic nervous system is sort of on, say you are scared, right? You're in the middle of the woods. Here's a really good example. You're in the middle of the woods and you're having a nice picnic. Your parasympathetic nervous system is working. You're really calm. And then you see a bear charging at you. Your sympathetic nervous system is going to kick in. Your pupils are going to dilate because you need to see what's around you. So your pupils are dilating so you can see everything that's going on. Your heart is accelerating. It's pumping oxygen throughout your body because you might need to run. You are going to stop digesting. So any food that you ate is going to be sitting in your stomach. Your stimulants, glucose, are released by the liver, right? So your body and your brain's going to need sugar to like burn through energy to get you out of that situation. Your adrenal glands and your kidneys are going to start secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine. Your bladder is going to relax. So a lot of times when people are in like severe like fear, they're going to like release their bladder and they're going to pee on themselves because your bladder is relaxing. So because other things are sort of taking precedent. And then it can stimulate ejaculation in a man if they're in intense fear or an intense situation that is causing the sympathetic nervous system to react. So sympathetic nervous system, you're being chased by a bear. Parasympathetic nervous system, you're having a relaxing picnic in a meadow. I want you to remember those two things. Okay, let's continue. So how does the endocrine system transmit information and interact with the nervous system? So the endocrine system is the body's slow chemical communication. It's made up of a set of glands that secrete hormones into the bloodstream. Hormones are chemical messengers manufactured by the endocrine glands. They travel throughout the bloodstream and affect other tissues, including the brain. And some hormones are chemically identical to, neurotransmitters. So some of the hormones that our body can produce or hormones that we take are chemically identical to the neurotransmitters we already have in our brain. So the endocrine system, it's a feedback system, the brain to the pituitary gland, to the other glands, to hormones, and then those hormones go back to the body and the brain. So this reveals an intimate connection between our nervous system and our endocrine system. And so here we have the different parts of our endocrine system, right? So we have the hypothalamus, which is the brain region controlling the pituitary gland. And then we have our pituitary gland, and it secretes many different hormones, some of which affect other glands. We have the thyroid gland that affects our metabolism, the parathyroids that help regulate the level of calcium in our blood. We have our adrenal glands, sort of behind our kidneys. The inner part helps trigger the fight or flight response. Our pancreas, it regulates the level of blood sugar in our blood. We have the testes, which secretes the male sex hormone, and then the ovaries, which secrete the female sex hormone. And so we have the system, right? We start in the brain and the pituitary gland, and then our pituitary gland starts sending information to some of our other glands, right? So it could go to the thyroid gland, and then our thyroid gland starts sending out hormones that affect our metabolism. And then that information is then goes back into our body and back up into our brain. So they're sort of connected. So how does neuroscientists study the brain's connection to behavior and mind, right? Scientists can selectively destroy or electrically, chemically, or magnetically stimulate the brain using various techniques. One of those is lesions, right? Naturally or experimentally cause destruction of brain tissue. The electroencephalogram, EEG, this is our other cat, Maple. Maple also says hi. EEG, an amplified recording of the waves of electrical activity sweeping across the brain surface. It's measured by electrodes placed on the scalp. So if you've ever watched something like House and you've seen an episode where a patient has electrodes all over their head, they're probably doing an EEG or an electroencephalogram. There's also the PET, positron emission tomography scan, the PET scan. It's a visual display of brain activity that detects where a radioactive form of glucose goes while the brain performs a given task, say reading or doing a math problem or writing, things like that. We also have the MRI, which is the magnetic resonance imaging. It's a technique that uses magnetic fields and radio waves to produce computer-generated images of soft tissue. So an MRI scans will show a brain's anatomy. So if you were trying to find out if, there is a tumor in a brain, you would use an MRI to be able to see the soft tissue. You then have a functional MRI, which is a technique revealing the blood flow and therefore brain activity by comparing successive MRI scans. So an fMRI shows brain function as well as brain structure. So let's see. This right here will show us two different structures in the brain. So we're going to start talking about older brain structures. So what structures make up the brainstem, and what are the functions of the brainstem, the thalamus, reticular formation, and cerebellum? So these are the less complex parts of our brain. Well, I guess I wouldn't say less complex, but they're the older parts. They're the most basic parts of our brain. So less complex brains and primitive vertebrates regulates basic survival functions. So more complex brains and advanced mammals, including humans, contain new brain systems and those old brain systems, right? So the brainstem, the thalamus, reticular formation, cerebellum, those are in primitive and more complex mammals and vertebrates. But it's the more advanced mammals like humans that have the extra parts. So we have our brainstem. It's the oldest and innermost region of the brain. It's where the spinal cord starts to swell as it enters the skull. The brainstem is responsible for all automatic survival functions. Being able to breathe, heart rate, things like that. It's your brainstem. The medulla is the base of the brainstem, controls your heartbeat and breathing. Brainstem is a crossover point where most nerves to and from each side of the brain connect with the body's opposite side. Let's see, there we go. Make sure, yeah. Okay, so then we have the thalamus. So we just talked about the brainstem. Now we're talking about the thalamus. It's the brain's sensory control center. It's located on top of the brainstem. It directs sensory messages to the cortex, and it transmits replies to the cerebellum and the medulla. Our cerebellum, aids in judgment of time, sound and texture discrimination, and emotional control. It coordinates voluntary movement and output and our balance. So being able to say balance on roller skates, balance on a skateboard, balance in dance or yoga, we can thank our cerebellum for that. It enables nonverbal learning and memory. So these older brain functions illustrate how our brain processes and stores most information outside of awareness. So then we go into the limbic system. So what are the limbic system structures and their functions? This is a neural system that sits between the brain's older parts and its cerebral hemispheres, right? We have the left and right hemisphere of the brain. It sits with the older parts in between those two hemispheres. It's a neural center that includes the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus, and is linked to emotion and drives. The amygdala consists of two lima bean-sized neural clusters in the limbic system, and it's linked to emotion. So like fear, anger, rage, happiness, things like that. The amygdala can be responsible for those really strong emotions. So here we have our brain, and we have some of our limbic system highlighted. We have the hypothalamus right here. We have our pituitary gland underneath it, right? Part of the, what's that? The endocrine system. We have the amygdala, and then we have our hippocampus. So this is our limbic system. It's really in the center of our brain. Excuse me. So we have, again, the brain structures and their functions. This goes into a little bit more detail. We have our full brain right here, and then we have our brain cut sort of in half right here of our left and right hemisphere. Our cerebral cortex is ultimate control and information processing center. The corpus callosum, which is the axon fibers connecting our two cerebral hemispheres together. So it's this bit right here that holds both parts together. Our thalamus, which relays messages between the lower brain centers and the cerebral cortex, which is like all of these lower brain centers up to our cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus right here, again, controls maintenance functions like eating, helps govern the endocrine system, and is linked to emotion and reward. Our pituitary glands, reticular formation, which helps control our arousal, pons, which helps coordinate our movement and controls our sleep, the medulla, right down here, remember it's that right as that brain spinal cord starts to go into the skull, this right here controls our heartbeat and our breathing. So getting an injury right at the base of your skull is really dangerous because it can impact our medulla, which controls our breathing and our heartbeat. Then our first spinal cord, which is pathway for neural fibers traveling to and from the brain. It controls our simple reflexes, so jerking things away, flinching, right? Spinal cord is partially responsible for that. Our cerebellum, which is the first thing that's formed at the back of our brain, coordinates voluntary movement and balance, and helps promote learning and memories of such. And we already talked about the amygdala and the hippocampus. We have the left and right hemisphere. Okay, we're going to continue. I'm actually going to pause right here. I know I said I wouldn't do two parts, but my computer is about to die. So we're going to pause right here. We're going to come back. Let me see how many slides we have left. We are at 30. So there's 53 total. So not too much longer. Part two won't be very long, but my computer is going to die. So I'm going to pause here. If you're following along, we are on slide 30. So when you pick up in part two, we're going to be, or sorry, we just stopped at slide 29. So if you're following along on part two, we are starting on page 30.